Sparta, around 500 BC. A father walks through the cold morning air toward a council building called the Leshke. In his arms, wrapped in cloth, is his newborn son. He's been a father for less than a week. Inside, a group of elderly men wait. They are the tribal elders, and they have one job: to examine every newborn male in Sparta. Not to celebrate the birth, not to bless the child, to judge whether this baby deserves to live. The elders unwrap the infant. They check his limbs, his spine, his eyes. They watch how he reacts to cold. According to some accounts, they bathe him in wine to see if he convulses or cries too much.
If the baby is well built and sturdy, the elders nod. The father is told to raise his son. The child is assigned one of the 9,000 plots of land that belong to full Spartan citizens. But if the baby is too small, too weak, has a twisted limb or a clouded eye, the elders shake their heads. The father is told to take his son to a place called the Apothetae, a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus. There, he will leave his child to die. This is how Sparta greeted its newborn sons. Not with celebration, but with judgment. Not with hope, but with a test. And this was only the beginning, because in Sparta, surviving your first week was just the first of many trials.
What came next, for the boys who passed that initial inspection, was 23 years of systematic brutality designed to transform them into the most feared warriors the ancient world had ever seen. Let me tell you what that looked like. First, some context. Sparta wasn't like other Greek city-states. Athens had philosophy, theater, democracy. Sparta had war. The entire society was organized around a single purpose: producing soldiers. Everything else, every law, every custom, every family structure existed to serve that goal. This obsession wasn't arbitrary. Sparta had a problem. The full citizens, the Spartiates, were vastly outnumbered by the people they had conquered and enslaved.
These slaves were called Helots, and according to the ancient historian Herodotus, there were 7 Helots for every Spartan citizen. Imagine living in a society where you're outnumbered 7-1 by people you've brutalized and stolen from, people who hate you, people who would kill you the moment they saw weakness. That fear shaped everything about Spartan society. It's why they couldn't afford weak soldiers. It's why they couldn't allow compassion to override utility. And it's why they developed the most brutal training system in the ancient world. Now, about that cliff, modern historians actually debate whether Spartans really threw infants off Mount Taygetus.
The primary source for this claim is Plutarch, who wrote centuries after Sparta's peak. And when archaeologists excavated the Apothetae in 1983, they found something interesting: 46 human skeletons. But not a single one was from an infant. They were all adult males, aged 18 to 35. The site appears to have been used for executing criminals and traitors, not disposing of babies. So did Spartans really kill weak infants? Probably yes, but perhaps not by throwing them off cliffs. More likely, as was common throughout the ancient Greek world, unwanted babies were simply exposed, left outside the city to die of cold, starvation, or predators. The difference in Sparta was that this wasn't just a family decision.
It was state policy. The government decided which babies lived and which died. And here's proof that the system wasn't absolute. Agesilaus II, one of Sparta's greatest kings, was born with a lame leg, a congenital deformity that should have sentenced him to death. But he survived, completed the brutal training program, and went on to rule Sparta for 40 years. Either the system had exceptions, or the mythology about Spartan infanticide was exaggerated even in ancient times. But let's assume a baby survived that first inspection. Let's follow him through the system that awaited. For 7 years, a Spartan boy lived at home with his mother. This was the only warmth he would ever know. At age 7, everything changed.
The state came for him. He was taken from his family and enrolled in the Agoge, the legendary Spartan training program. For the next 23 years, until age 30, his life belonged to Sparta. The boys were organized into herds, like animals. They lived in communal barracks, sleeping on beds they had to make themselves from reeds they gathered from riverbanks. No blankets, no pillows, no comfort of any kind. They were given 1 cloak per year, 1, regardless of weather. In the brutal Greek winters, they froze. In summer, they baked. The cloak became filthy, torn, infested. It didn't matter. You made it last. They went barefoot, always. The idea was that shoes made you soft.
A soldier needed feet like leather, capable of marching across any terrain. So boys ran across rocks, through thorns, over frozen ground, until their feet became so calloused they barely felt pain anymore. They were deliberately underfed. The portions at communal meals were calculated to be insufficient. A growing boy was always hungry. This wasn't negligence, it was policy. Hunger was supposed to make them resourceful. And here's where Spartan logic gets twisted. The boys were encouraged to steal food. Not just allowed, encouraged. Stealing was considered a valuable skill for a future soldier. Cunning, stealth, initiative. These were military virtues. But if you got caught, you were beaten savagely. Not for stealing, for getting caught.
The crime wasn't theft. The crime was incompetence. Plutarch tells a story, possibly legendary, about a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When adults approached, he stood perfectly still rather than reveal his theft. The fox, panicking, began to claw and bite at his stomach. The boy didn't move, didn't make a sound. He let the fox tear into his flesh rather than be discovered. He died from his wounds, but he died with his honor intact. This was the mentality Sparta cultivated. Pain was irrelevant. Shame was everything. The training included sports, but not the kind you're thinking. Boys competed in wrestling, boxing, and a particularly brutal game where 2 teams tried to drive each other off an island using any means necessary. Pushing, kicking, biting, gouging. No rules, just violence. Older boys were expected to fight younger ones. The younger boys were expected to fight back. If they cried, they were mocked. If they showed fear, they were beaten by their peers. The system weaponized shame, turning every child into an enforcer of Spartan values. And then there was the whipping. Every year, at a sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Artemis Orthia, Spartan boys participated in a ritual called the Diamastagosis. They had to steal cheeses from an altar, while older boys, armed with whips, tried to stop them.
The goal was to endure as much pain as possible without crying out. Boys competed to see who could take the most punishment. They stood there, being flogged, while crowds watched. Parents watched. The whole community watched a child being beaten bloody and cheered if he didn't scream. Some boys died during this ritual. That wasn't a tragedy. That was considered an honorable death. By the Roman period, when Sparta had lost its military power but kept its rituals as tourist attractions, the Diamastagosis had evolved into an outright blood sport. An amphitheater was built so crowds could better watch boys being whipped. Romans traveled to Sparta specifically to see this spectacle. The training wasn't just physical.
There was psychological conditioning too.
Boys were taught to speak in a particular way, using as few words as possible. This is where we get the word laconic, from Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. A Spartan was supposed to be brief, blunt, cutting. Words were for weaklings. Real men communicated through action. They were also taught music, dancing, and poetry, but always in service of military values. The songs were about warriors, heroes, sacrifice. The dances were about battle formations. Even culture was weaponized. Now, you might wonder about education, reading, writing, mathematics. The Spartans had a saying about that. They learned to read and write just enough to serve their turn. Everything else was about making soldiers. This educational deficit would eventually become a serious problem. Sparta produced extraordinary warriors, but mediocre diplomats, administrators, and strategists. They could win battles, but couldn't manage an empire. Their single-minded focus on military training left them intellectually stunted compared to Athenians, who were reading philosophy while Spartans were learning to steal cheese. At age 20, something remarkable happened. The boys who survived became men. They were assigned to a sycetia, a communal mess hall where they would eat every meal for the rest of their lives. These mess groups became their true families. They trained together, ate together, and eventually fought together.
The bonds forged in the Agoge were stronger than blood, but they still weren't done. Full citizenship didn't come until age 30. Until then, they lived in barracks. They could marry, but they couldn't live with their wives. A young Spartan husband would sneak out at night to visit his wife, then return to the barracks before dawn. Some Spartans reportedly had children before they ever saw their wife's face in daylight. And what about the Spartan women? Their lives were unusual too, though in different ways. Spartan girls weren't sent to the Agoge, but they did receive physical training. Running, wrestling, throwing the javelin and discus. They exercised outdoors, often naked or in minimal clothing, which scandalized other Greeks.
The reasoning was coldly eugenic. Strong mothers produce strong sons. Women needed to be physically fit to give birth to warriors. Their bodies, like the men's, belonged to the state. Spartan women married later than other Greek women, typically around 18 or 20 instead of 14. They were better fed than women elsewhere in Greece. They could own property, run businesses, and speak their minds in ways that would have been unthinkable in Athens. But all of this freedom existed to serve one purpose: producing soldiers. And the women internalized this mission completely. Spartan mothers became famous for their brutal expectations.
When a son went to war, the traditional farewell was to hand him his shield and say, "Return with it or on it," meaning, come back victorious or come back dead. Don't you dare come back having dropped your shield and run away. Plutarch records stories of Spartan mothers killing their own sons who had shown cowardice in battle. Whether these stories are true or propaganda, they reveal what Sparta wanted the world to believe about itself. Now, let's talk about what the Spartans did to maintain their system. Because remember, they were outnumbered 7-1 by slaves who would happily murder them. Every autumn, the Spartan government did something extraordinary. The ephors, the magistrates who ran the city's affairs, formally declared war on the Helots, their own slave population. This wasn't symbolic. It was legal cover for murder. Once war was declared, any Spartan could kill any Helot without religious pollution. No trial, no justification needed. Murder became not just legal, but encouraged. The elite graduates of the Agoge were organized into a special force called the Cryptia. Think of them as a secret police, though the term doesn't quite capture what they did. These young men were sent into the countryside with knives. They hid during the day. At night, they hunted. Their targets were Helots, specifically the strongest, most capable Helots, the ones who might become leaders.
The ones who might organize resistance. These were murdered in their fields, in their homes, on the roads. The Cryptia killed systematically, culling any potential threats. One ancient source describes how they would prowl through villages, looking for the biggest, most muscular Helots, and cut them down. It didn't matter if these men had done anything wrong. Their crime was being strong enough to potentially fight back. Thucydides, the historian, recorded an incident that shows how far Sparta was willing to go. At some point before 424 BC, the Spartans announced that Helots who had distinguished themselves in military service would be granted their freedom. This was unprecedented.
2,000 Helots came forward, the bravest and most capable among them. The Spartans crowned them with wreaths, led them to temples in celebration, and then murdered every single one of them. 2,000 men, killed for the crime of being too capable, too brave, too likely to be dangerous if they ever turned against their masters. The Spartans had used the promise of freedom as a trap to identify and eliminate their most threatening slaves. This is the reality behind the Spartan legend. Yes, they were extraordinary warriors. Yes, 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae against an army of tens of thousands. Yes, they dominated Greece for generations. But that dominance was built on systematic cruelty.
On the murder of infants, on the brutalization of children, on the terrorizing and slaughter of enslaved people, on a system that treated human beings as raw material to be processed into weapons. And here's the irony. The system destroyed itself. Sparta's obsession with military purity created a population crisis. Full citizens had to maintain a certain level of wealth to afford their membership in the Syssitia. Those who couldn't were demoted to a lower class. Meanwhile, the rigid system produced fewer and fewer children. Spartan women often refused to have large families. Why would they? Their sons would just be taken away at age 7 to be brutalized by the state. By the 4th century BC, Sparta was running out of Spartans.
At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, they fielded only about 700 full citizens. They lost to Thebes, and their hegemony over Greece ended forever. The legendary training system, the brutality, the infanticide, the murder of slaves, all of it had produced a warrior culture that couldn't sustain itself. Sparta became a footnote, eventually conquered by Rome, its fearsome reputation reduced to a tourist attraction, where visitors could watch boys being whipped for entertainment. The Agoge continued in some form for centuries, long after Sparta had any real military power. It became a kind of theme park of brutality, preserving the rituals without the purpose. Roman tourists would visit to watch the floggings, the same way we might visit a historical reenactment today. What does Sparta teach us? Perhaps that any system built entirely on violence will eventually turn that violence inward. Or that a society without compassion cannot reproduce itself. Or simply that the myths we tell about strength and weakness are often covers for cruelty. The Spartans believed they were creating perfect soldiers. What they actually created was a death cult. A society so obsessed with producing warriors that it forgot to produce people. Those babies left on Mount Taygetus, if they were ever really left there, they were just the beginning.
The ones who survived faced something almost worse, a childhood designed to destroy everything soft in them everything kind, everything human. And in the end, it destroyed Sparta too. There's one more thing worth mentioning. The Spartans weren't as unique as they wanted to believe. Infanticide was practiced throughout the ancient Greek world. In Athens, fathers had absolute power over whether their children lived or died. Unwanted babies, especially girls, were routinely exposed. The difference was that in Athens, this was a family decision. In Sparta, it was state policy. And that's what makes Sparta so chilling. It wasn't just that individuals did terrible things.
It was that the entire society organized itself around doing terrible things. The cruelty was systematic. It was official. It had rituals and institutions and philosophical justifications. Modern scholars have compared the Agoge to the indoctrination of child soldiers in contemporary conflicts. The parallels are uncomfortable. Take children from their families at a young age, subject them to brutal conditioning, use violence and shame to break down their individual identity, replace family bonds with loyalty to the group, train them to see killing as normal. This is what Sparta did for centuries, and they were celebrated for it. Other Greeks admired Spartan discipline, Spartan courage, Spartan simplicity.
Philosophers like Plato praised the Spartan system as an ideal society. Even Aristotle, who criticized some aspects of Spartan life, treated them as a serious model of governance. The Spartan myth has echoed through history. The Nazis were fascinated by Sparta, seeing in it a model for their own eugenic fantasies. Modern fitness culture sometimes invokes Spartan imagery, as if those ancient warriors were just extreme athletes, rather than products of institutionalized child abuse. We should be more careful. When we celebrate Spartan strength, we're celebrating a system that murdered babies for being born different, that beat children until they stopped crying, that hunted slaves for sport.
That turned the entire purpose of human existence into producing more efficient killers. The 300 at Thermopylae were brave. They were also the products of a society built on horror. Both things can be true. The question isn't whether Spartans were impressive warriors. They were. The question is what it cost to make them that way, and whether any amount of military glory is worth the price of a civilization that throws its children off cliffs. The babies at the Apothetae, if they existed, had no names, no graves, no one to mourn them. They were judged unworthy before they had a chance to be anything at all. And the boys who survived, who made it through the Agoge, who became the warriors Sparta wanted, they too were victims.
Robbed of their childhoods, their families, their capacity for tenderness. Sparta didn't create soldiers. It created survivors of a system so brutal that becoming a killer was the only way out. That's the real legacy of Sparta. Not glory, trauma.